Welcome to a Rice University digital media production. For more information about us, please visit our website at www.rice.edu.
Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this first colloquium in our spring semester series. I'm not totally sure that our decision to be inside today rather than in Ray Courtyard on this glorious afternoon was the right one, but with the sun setting early and the chilliness setting in pretty fast after that, I think we're going to be glad that we are inside, and we'll try to get outside for the next February 12th one. I am Susan McIntosh, and I'm the director of Scientia. And as those of you who joined us last semester know, our theme this year pays homage to the central activity of the university, which is the exploration in all its many facets of ideas. And we are serving one of our core missions in Scientia here with this kind of event, which is to sponsor encounters and events that build a university community and allow us to interact across disciplinary lines, bring us all together for conversation and exchange of ideas. And we have this time asked 4 speakers, as we have in the past colloquia, to focus on an idea that has powerfully influenced and intellectually engaged them. It need not be related to their research, but we ask them to speak on it for about 5 minutes. We allow a little bit of latitude over that, but not much, because this is part of the challenge, to condense it and hone it into a very brief talk. And I'm indebted to our 4 exceptional speakers today for accepting this challenge. I know that you're all very keen to hear what they have to say. So without further ado, and in keeping with the brevity of our proceedings without lengthy introductions for each speaker, we'll begin. And there will be no question and answer period, but we hope that you will stay and mingle at the reception that follows, talk with each other, talk with our speakers. That's one of the reasons that we've put on a fairly substantial reception, and it will last for a half an hour, 45 minutes, as long as people are interested in staying. So our first speaker today is Jane Grande-Allen, Associate Professor in the Department of Bioengineering, speaking on mechanobiology.
Thanks. All right. Thank you. I'm going to start with a quiz. How many of you have heart valves? Show of hands. Heart valves. All right, there you go, good, all right. Okay, good. So you should relate to this, okay. Okay. So all of you are supposed to have 4 heart valves, and they should last for billions and billions of heartbeats. But many children are born with fewer than 4 heart valves, and many people have to have their heart valves replaced or surgically repaired when they get older. So I want to lead up to an idea that drives a lot of my research. So I believe that heart valve tissues are the most mechanically active tissue in the body. So there's 4 valves: aortic, pulmonary, mitral, and tricuspid, and they're located at the exit and entrance from the main pumping part of the heart, the ventricle. And with every cardiac cycle, these little tissue flaps will open and close a hole about the size of a quarter or 50-cent piece, and they slam together with enough force that you can hear it outside the body. So this is the heartbeat. It's due to the heart valves. So Leonardo da Vinci famously described how the motion of the heart valves was guided by the flow of blood and the shape of the heart and the shape of the blood vessels that emanate from the heart. And for hundreds of years, his detailed description of the anatomy actually defined the state of art of our understanding of heart valves, just this an anatomic level. But the anatomy actually is critically important. So the mitral valve, which is the most complicated valve, has two flap-like leaflets. And so one of them is large like a toilet seat lid, and the other one wraps around that. So, and then attached beneath these two leaflets are many string-like tissues called chordae, and they connect at the other end down, nestled into the left ventricle. So the coordinated motion of the leaflets and chordae help generate blood pressure, drive forward flow of blood through the heart into the body, and prevent the reverse flow of blood. So, the large leaflet and the chordae bear most of the pressure load. It's like a parachute, and so these parachute-like tissues are being pulled on, which is tension, a type of force. So the other leaflet, the one that wraps around, helps seal the edges of the valve together so that you don't have blood leaking backwards. And so these edges of the leaflet are actually pushing on each other, which is compression, a completely fundamentally different type of force. So what are heart valves made of that makes them so good at either bearing force or tensile force or compressive force, depending on what part of the valve you're considering? And I've been interested in how these forces change in valve disease. But we need to know more than the anatomy to understand this. So during the 20th century, there were great advances in how to study the extracellular matrix, so the material that the cells secrete, such as collagen and elastin, and understanding how these organize into load-bearing connective tissues. So, for example, we now know that there's a thick layer of collagen fibers in the heart valve leaflets that gives the valve strength and tension. But there's other kinds of extracellular matrix in heart valves that we're just beginning to figure out, such as proteoglycans. So these are very complex carbohydrates, and they make up most of the inner layer of heart valves, and there are far, far more of them in diseased heart valves. But these molecules are really difficult to study, so we don't know as much about them in general, much less what they're doing in heart valves. So the next generation of heart valve analysis involves mechanobiology. So much of my research deals with the idea that heart valve cells respond to this mechanical stimulation, whether this is tension or compression, and how much of it there is and what frequency it's applied at, or whether the cells are just residing within a stiff environment or a soft environment. So the cells generally respond to mechanical stimulation by proliferating or dividing or moving around or making more extracellular matrix. And so to probe these responses, we do lots of experiments where we apply different amounts of mechanical stimulation. So because the most common mitral valve disease, which is called myxoid degeneration, which affects a lot of people, it's estimated 1 in 20 men around the age of 60, involves lower tension but more proteoglycans. I'm particularly interested in understanding how we can mechanically regulate how cells produce proteoglycans. So far we've been able to manipulate the valve cells in our little bioreactors into making different kinds of proteoglycans and different amounts of proteoglycans. And now we are able to take a whole mitral valve that we get from a pig heart, grow it inside a bioreactor under conditions of reduced tension, and within 1 week it starts to turn into a myxoid valve. So the goal ultimately is to develop new treatments for heart valve disease that are based on this underlying idea of mechanobiology. There we go. Or new medications that can reverse or prevent the progression of valve disease. And in my opinion, just based on this idea of mechanically active tissue, these treatments must be developed with an appreciation for heart valves as living mechanical dynamos. Thanks.
Thank you, Jane. Wonderful example how a complex idea can be elucidated wonderfully in 5 minutes. Thank you. All right, our next speaker, James Pomerantz. Jim Pomerantz, professor in the Department of Psychology, Mind, Brain, and Reality.
Thank you all, and thanks, Jane, although I don't look forward to following you. So my job today is to persuade you in 5 minutes that I'm not the person you think you see, and that McMurtry Auditorium is not the environment which you see yourself to be. That when we contemplate the world around us, we are confronted with the most fundamental and immediate fact of our existence, that here I am, here is the world, and it's our senses that put us in direct contact with that world, and our senses rarely miss things or get things wrong. So I'm here to pop that bubble, and you've probably heard others try to pop that bubble as well, but I'm going to take it from a neuroscience angle. You've probably heard philosophers who have speculated that perhaps the external world does not even exist. Let's set that one aside, because if it's true, it doesn't really matter, and I'm not really giving this talk. Physicists tell us things that defy our common sense view of the world, mostly things involving concepts like entanglement and Heisenberg uncertainty. Tell us about how objects can exist in multiple places at one time, that Schrödinger's cat is both dead and alive simultaneously. And this has led one physicist to note, let's get rid of the word reality. It just gets in the way. So today I'm going to challenge the concept that our senses put us in direct contact with the world from the neuroscience angle, and start again with the claim that the external world is not even remotely what it appears to be through our senses. The fact that different animals and even different people see the world so differently guarantees the fact that we can't see the external world correctly, because if we disagree with each other, we can't all be right. Our brains and our senses connect us to the world, but their job does not include making or registering an accurate or faithful copy of the external world, instead just establishing a functional mapping. And to try to make that a little more concrete, let's take the example of color. Color does not exist in the physical world. Even Isaac Newton knew that. What exists in the physical world is wavelength. Color exists only between our ears. So when we see the colored stripes in the rainbow, those colors are fictitious, and the number of stripes we see, typically 7, is a wholly arbitrary number. When we experience a color like yellow, there's actually nothing yellow inside our brains. In fact, if you cut the skull open, it's quite dark in there. If you cut it open, our brains look pink. If we look at the color yellow on a TV set and then we zoom in on it closely, we see that what we perceive as yellow is actually just the juxtaposition of bright red and bright green pixels with no yellow represented at all. The blue pixel is turned off. If we turn it on, then the screen goes white, another illusion. But even our experience of the red, green, and blue pixels is problematic, because they're not colored any more than the microwaves from our microwave oven are colored, or the signals coming in and out of our cell phones are colored. So no, what yellow means, and what yellow means only, is that certain neurons in our brain are firing and others are not. In fact, we all possess sheets of neurons that basically form a map of the world, basically a false colored map. Now, we're all familiar with false color maps coming, say, from the Hubble telescope, and that's all well and good. The problem is that all maps are false colored, because color is a product of this nervous system. So here, my friends, we confront one of the most profound mysteries of the brain. How can the firing of one neuron represent yellow, the firing of another neuron represent red, another neuron represents middle C on the piano, and another one represents an emotion or an odor or a memory? All of our neurons are basically bags of salt water with ions flowing in and out, but the experiences they create for us subjectively are radically different. When those neurons fire, we experience events and we project them to the outside world, even if they've been faultily triggered from the inside. The second great mystery of the mind and brain is why it is that stimulation of certain highly select neurons leads to conscious experience, but the firing or activation of other neurons does not. So if we take, for example, people whose visual cortex in the back of the brain has been damaged. If we send light into those people's eyes, and even though the neurons in the eyeball itself are activated, they see nothing. If, on the other hand, we take people whose eyes are damaged, but whose cortex in the back of the brain is functioning, and we stimulate those neurons in the back with electrodes, they experience conscious experience of, they actively perceive light. And so why is it that certain neurons firing yields conscious experience and others does not? But why, in fact, do we have consciousness in the first place? We know very well that certain areas of the brain are capable of complex functioning like regulating organ function without conscious experience at all. Thank goodness. Would you really want to be aware of how your brain is regulating your kidney right now? But if that's the case, then what exactly does consciousness add? What does it bring to the table? So, do we just make up our reality? No, we couldn't be fabricating our reality or we wouldn't survive through evolution. The answer is instead that we create a neural model of the world around us. And it is that model of the world that we perceive and not the reality, even though our conscious experience tells us to the contrary. The next step in this argument, and the crucial one, is that that model, internal model in our brain of the world, need not resemble the world. It only needs to correlate with it. Let's take as an analogy the way in which a lock fits with a key. A lock and a key do not resemble one another, but there's a complementarity between the two, a going together or a meshing. And then the idea is that our neural activation meshes or corresponds with the outside world, but it doesn't look like it any more than a pattern of zeros and ones in a computer file resembles a Picasso painting or a Mozart concerto. 24 hours ago, I wasn't sure I was going to be able to make this talk because I was battling with a condition called vertigo. If you've not had the pleasure, try to keep it that way. At any rate, vertigo makes your head spin, and my particular brand of vertigo is caused by calcium deposits that collect in the fluid of the semicircular canals of your inner ear and come to rest on the little hair cells that normally respond to acceleration. And so if one of these calcium crystals lands on a hair cell and bends it, something right out of Jane's type of mechanobiology research, that triggers neurons that tell you the world is spinning. It's just identical to a world that's actually spinning. So when our neurons and the external world disagree with one another, the neurons win every time as far as our experience is concerned. We are all prisoners of our neural architecture. So if all you want to know is how our brains allow us to function in the world, little of what I'm talking about today constitutes a problem. But if you want to know what is reality really like, my best advice is to agree with those who say, forget about it. You're never going to know it. And am I really the person standing before you that you see me to be? Well, if you still believe that, let me close by noting that I am not just me. I am, in fact, an entire colony. We know that people, all of us in this room, are comprised of billions of cells, but that by cell count, most of the cells in our bodies don't belong to us, but belong to other microorganisms like mites and bacteria. So on behalf of all of us here at the podium, thank you for listening.
Jim, thank you. All right, our next speaker, Marcia Brennan, Associate Professor in Religious Studies and Art History, The Love of Wisdom and the Wisdom of Love.
6 minutes. Thank you. Thank you. I think it's so great that I'm here giving a Scientia lecture, and I'm going to be telling you some love stories. In the university, we're all familiar with the concept of the love of wisdom, which is otherwise known as philosophy. Many of us hold degrees in this area, and our research and teaching reflect this love of knowledge. But if we transpose the key words, what we have is a doubling in the wisdom of love. This formulation expresses the gift of multiplicity, that is, the ability to occupy multiple locations at once, and this has been one of Rice's most valuable gifts to me. In my day job, I'm an associate professor of art history and religious studies, and my research areas include modern and contemporary art history and museum studies, comparative mysticism, and the medical humanities. But in addition to my life at Rice, for the past 4 years, it's also been my privilege to serve as an artist in residence in the Department of Palliative Medicine at the MD Anderson Cancer Center. In the hospital context, I work as a creative writer with individuals at the very end of life. To phrase this in technical terms, my clinical work unfolds at the intersection of aesthetics and psychosocial oncology in the care of terminal cancer patients. As an artist in residence, I constantly confront the challenge of creating human connections across a formidable gulf of separation. Frequently, when I initially approach a patient, I'm told that the work sounds so interesting, but I have no artistic ability. This invites me to respond, well, let's just say for a moment that you did have artistic ability. What images would you want to write about? Depending on the circumstances, I might also ask, where are you from? What do you love to do? Or even more simply, but never ever simply, what do you love? Very often, a flash of illumination will become visible on the person's face, and they'll share the image with me. They'll describe a scene or a subject, while I gently encourage them to talk and make notes to help crystallize their thoughts. Once the artwork is complete, I record the person's words and while making any additions or corrections that they indicate. The narrative is then inscribed into a handmade paper journal, which the person can keep and share with their family, either as a medium for further creative expression or as a legacy gift that performs a memorial function. In that way, the portable microenvironment of the text provides a durable yet tender memory of this transient moment in a person's life. So, in my 4 years of doing this work, I have repeatedly found that an open heart can lead to a heightened state of conceptual awareness, which, in turn, can directly enhance creativity and knowledge production. Today, I have time only to tell you 2 brief stories that exemplify the ways in which the love of wisdom can become reflected in the wisdom of love. The first story is called Between Water and Sky. One day, I received a physician's referral to work with a middle-aged man whose esophageal cancer had spread throughout his entire body. When I asked him about his cherished images and memories, he simply said, "I love to fish, and that being in the water holds a special place in my heart." He also shared his sadness and concern, a theme that I hear all too frequently, regarding how he will be remembered by his young daughter. I knew then that we'd be making a memory as a gift for her. This man described an image of himself wade fishing, standing on a long sandbar casting his line. In his gentle and softly cadenced tones, it was clear that he had reached a place of peace and that he had already positioned himself in a middle ground or intermediate layer between the earth and the sky. After visiting for about an hour, I inscribed the man's words into a handmade paper journal. As he said, "For my daughter, I'd like you to know how much I love the water. That has a special place in my heart. There's nothing better than the sun coming up in the morning. Sometimes when I'm fishing, I'm wearing a light blue shirt, something between the water and the sky." On another day, I met a middle-aged woman at the very end of life who suffered from neurocranial cancer with advanced brain metastasis. Sitting quietly together, we spoke about her passion for gardening with wildflowers, her love of paisley prints, and the unique meanings that these designs held for her as metaphorical expressions of spiritual insight. As she told me, "I love gardening. I had wildflowers, and at a ranch I planted a huge field of lavender. The flowers came back every year, and it's beautiful at the ranch. I also love paisley, and I always have paisley on my mind. I like bright colors. With paisley, the color mixture is so nice and flowing. One color looks like it came out of the other. I like to have God as my savior. I'm interested in the mixture of all religions. With that, you get a viewpoint of the all, like paisley." After I read this woman her story, she expressed some surprise that she'd actually spoken those words aloud, since, as she told me, she tended to be quite shy and reserved about her spirituality. Through the correspondences that she perceived between the abstract flowing patterns and the chromatic resonance of wildflowers and paisley, this woman found an evocative metaphor to describe her perception of the ways in which forms and meanings could materialize and dematerialize, crystallize and dissolve. This fluid, transitional imagery enabled her to find words to represent an otherwise unrepresentable vision of inclusive divine presence. When viewed collectively, these stories suggest some of the ways in which the gift of multiplicity can help us to think beyond familiar boundaries, to develop strategies to represent the unrepresentable, and to find language to describe states of being for which there is no language. Indeed, my experiences have provided invaluable insights into the ways in which existential trauma and human crises can be profoundly intertwined with vivid expressions of beauty, joy, gratitude, and love. Just as each encounter is unique, these complex subjects frequently become expressed through words and images that simultaneously evoke presence and absence, assertion and negation, and often their mutual transcendence within a single interpretive framework. When this occurs, multiple domains of knowledge, including the rational and the intuitive, the analytical and the imaginative, can shed powerful light on one another, just as the love of wisdom becomes reflected in the wisdom of love. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcia, for that very powerful. Only 6 minutes. It's so much packed into those brief 6 minutes. Our last speaker is Yousif Shamoo, professor of biochemistry and cell biology, saying goodbye to Rube Goldberg. There's your 6 minutes.
All right. Thank you very much for coming here today. I don't know how many of you know what a Rube Goldberg machine. A show of hands, those that do? Oh, basically everybody. But the one person who may not know, it's a very complicated machine that does a very simple task. Usually it's like a mouse trap that goes off, that knocks a ping pong ball into dominoes. The dominoes go down, pop a balloon, which then triggers a Bunsen burner to ring a doorbell. And he was very famous for concocting these very complicated machines that would do very simple tasks. And what I'm going to tell you about today is kind of how I've gone from understanding and thinking about biology as a machine, as a process, to thinking about biology as a system or a network. And this has come about because everything about the world has changed in the brief time that I have been here. And what I mean by that is when I was an undergraduate and I was learning biology for the first time, I was introduced to the idea that cells were factories, that they had assembly lines. They would make molecules by assembling them and putting them together. It was very much in the same kind of thinking as you might imagine a car factory that Henry Ford had designed, in the early part of the century. And so the idea was that cells were like factories. They would make things, they would produce things, and it was very hierarchical too. The structures were very much like there was master controllers and controlling elements, and it was very, very linear in its thinking and approach. And as a consequence, that's how I viewed biology. That's how I viewed cells. Now, this was the thinking of the 1980s and the 1990s as we went on. And most recently, my field has undergone a huge transformation. We now think of everything in terms of complex networks and structures, kind of like the internet. Okay? We no longer think of cells. We no longer think of biological systems as these sort of linear processes that produce something at the end, like a car or a molecule. We think of them instead as a series of interactions that are happening dynamically, coming and going and flowing and ebbing all the time in cells. And as I adjusted my thinking about biology from this sort of linear thinking to this sort of network thinking, I realized that that's how society has changed as well. And I began to wonder, well, what came first? When I was an undergraduate learning about biology, when you think about how industry and technology was organized in this country, it was very much in this sort of assembly line way of thinking. We thought of companies built things in assembly lines. We perceived things as hierarchical structures. Everything in our worldview, culturally, was developed through this way of thinking. But now everything is different. For the current generation of undergraduates, you can't even imagine a world that kind of simple and plain. Your world is, of course, networks. It is, of course, interactions, because you have Facebook, you have social networks, you have all sorts of media to interact with, all sorts of information that I could never have dreamed of in 1985, like the internet, okay, Wikipedia, or any of those things. And so biology has changed, but I wonder what's changing what? Is it that science and technology are allowing us to see things in this new way? Or did the rise of things like the internet make me think about biology as a complicated network? Now, of course, there's probably no simple black and white truth there. It's probably that social values and culture moves hand in hand with science and technology. As the internet was built, people began to think about processes like biology as happening as networks. And to give you an example, of how, in particular, my field has been affected, I was taught that proteins, these molecules that carry out a lot of the processes and chemistry of life, were like machines. They had articulations, they opened and closed. They would do things, they would make molecules by modifying them and spitting them out, just like a little machine. And of course, we would study these machines in great, great reductionist detail, okay? So let me give you an example based on my anatomy. Let's just imagine that I'm the protein. So what would happen is a sort of a 1980s or 1990s scientist, we would examine me and say, look, he has an elbow joint. He can do that, right? That's pretty cool. And he can sort of move. He can walk. He can move. And you would then take apart my arm, right? And you would look at the arm flex. Oh, look at that. Jane would love the mechanobiology of that, right? She'd be taking apart my heart valves and seeing how they pump and how they would actuate and things like that. And that gets you pretty far. But there's a lot of things that happen in biology that are not the product of a simple one molecule or reductionist way of thinking. The whole ensemble of molecules are interacting to give rise to emergent kinds of behaviors and properties that you could not have seen in any one individual. And to sort of think about this, what this means for me as a biologist, you have to consider that when I was an undergraduate, essentially all I was ever going to learn was about me, this one protein and this one ability to do, say, maybe one action or one chemistry. But now it's as if instead of just taking a picture of me and looking at my joints and how they move, I'm going to watch Yousif all day. I'm going to take pictures of him all day. And I'm going to look at the interactions he makes all day. So it's not just what I can do as an individual, but all the interactions I make with you, all the interactions I make with my students, all the interactions I make with my colleagues throughout the course of the day. That's going to be a representation of me in this biological world. So the dimensionality of that problem is essentially mind-blowing. We're going from a sort of simplistic way of thinking about biology to one in which I think about the whole ensemble and how the whole thing comes together. And for me as a scientist, this has been really transformative for me to go from this sort of simple linear thinking to these networks and systems. And you see it now in our field. It's called systems biology. In fact, we have a new PhD program in systems biology. And it's all about these emergent properties that you can understand only in the collection, but not by studying individuals. And so for me, this has been a real change in how I think about not just my field, but my interaction with my world, because I still think and I wonder, well, what's happening first? Is science and technology enabling my mind to perceive these greater realities like systems and complex networks? Or is it the culture and the society, the internet made me think about biology in this way? I don't have an answer. It's an open question that I invite you to talk about at the reception. But for me, this has changed how I view all of biology. For those of you who are undergraduates now, it's how you see life anyway. And so it's not a revelation for you. And I think that's kind of interesting. I don't know 30 years from now, when you're in my position, what the revelations will be. I can only imagine they will be equally transformative. And I think that's a very exciting thing to be at in terms of being at a university and being associated with a place like Rice. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Yousif. So I'd like at this point just to thank all four speakers for the wonderful job that they did in taking complex and provocative subjects and making them accessible. And I think that, they have all done a marvelous job in bringing us into the space that Scientia likes to create opportunities to inhabit, specifically an interdisciplinary space. We've all been talking about issues of interpretation, perception, representation, and that cross disciplinary lines, and even cell biologists engage with these issues in trying to interpret the data that they deal with. So I think we have an awful lot potentially talk about at the reception. I invite you out to join us and would remind you that 1 week from today at 7 in the evening, we are having the Bachner Lecture, which is the premier lecture that Scientia organizes, and Professor Alan Matisow will be speaking on the very powerful idea of Zionism, America, and the creation of the State of Israel. Professor Matisow is, as many of you know, an absolutely legendary lecturer. So we are very excited to contemplate his upcoming talk. And then we will meet again on February 12th for the next in our Power of Ideas series. So I hope to see you all there. Thank you all so much for coming today, and please join us at the reception.
This program is protected by copyright and may not be redistributed in whole or in part without the express written consent of Rice University Digital Media Services.